Hello, my name is Omar Sanchez for the Sam Proctor Oral History Program. Today's date is March 12th, 2021. We're doing this interview on Zoom. I'm here with Dr. Nicolas Vargas. Do you want to introduce more about yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm Professor Vargas, Nicolas Vargas. I'm an associate professor currently between the Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Law. And I coordinate the Latinx Studies specialization in the master's program in the Center for Latin American Studies. And I teach a lot of courses related to race, inequality, and Latinos and Latinx studies more broadly.
Do you mind telling me how long have you been here at University of Florida, your goals in life and your career plan, I guess?
Okay, so how long I've been here, my goals in life and my career plan. All right.
You take it step by step.
Okay, well, how long have I been at Florida? Well, I earned my master's degree at Florida, right? So I was here for a few years as a graduate student in sociology. And then I went elsewhere to earn my PhD. So I have some familiarity with the institution in that way. And then after my PhD, I took a job elsewhere, and then I was hired in this role for a position between the Center for Latin American Studies and Sociology. I think I'm the first professor to be hired at the University of Florida for a job that said Latino Studies in the job description. That was in 2015 to help kind of solidify Latino Studies specialization in the Center for Latin American Studies. The Center for Latin American Studies is a renowned center, widely known. I have a lot of really brilliant, excellent scholars as colleagues who know a great deal, about the socio-political, economic, and kind of the kind of ecological context of Latin America, as well as folks who focus on environmental issues of Latin America. But for a very long period of time, the Center for Latin American Studies kind of didn't have that other piece of the puzzle, especially when we're thinking about Latinos within the context of the US. They focus Latin America, but not what happens when Latin Americans become, Latinx Latinos, or when they move to the US. So my line was established to help kind of solidify that program here at the University of Florida, especially first at the graduate level. And I'm working on initiatives to try to advance that at the undergraduate level as well. So I've been here in that role since 2015. So I think it's 6 years now. And my career goals, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. My career goals are really to try to provide opportunities for students who sometimes maybe haven't had a clear vision of what their career pathways would be. Maybe I can talk a little bit about maybe my educational history, or do we have a question?
Yeah, definitely. You can go ahead.
So I'm a first generation college student. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college before. My father, is from Puerto Rico. He was born in the United States, moved back and forth between Puerto Rico and the United States, has 10 brothers and sisters. So I have, there's 11 in the family, many cousins. My mom is white from central Pennsylvania, rural, almost Appalachia, poor, impoverished kind of area. They both joined the military. They're to essentially pull themselves out of poverty, and that's where they met, in the military. We ended up moving back to that small town, and faced some challenges for being, my father was, one of the only Latinos, in the community, one of the only people who spoke Spanish, in a 99.5% white rural space in central Pennsylvania, and he faced a lot of challenges there, and that went on to, I think, shape, our upbringing in some capacity. What was, I guess, getting back to the first generation college thing, we didn't really grow up around lots of folks who had college degrees, people with letters behind their names, MD, JD, MA, that wasn't common, PhD. So I never really saw that as a pathway for me, even in my dreams, that just wasn't a reality. The people that I knew, the people that we hung out with, that wasn't their lives. And because it wasn't the lives of anything that was familiar to me, it also didn't become part of my dreams for myself. I knew there were people like that existed out in the world that did work like that. There were lawyers and doctors and professors, but nobody in our social circle was doing a lot of that work. So I joined the military in order to pay for college. I joined the Air Force National Guard in Pennsylvania at the age of 17. 1 month before 9/11 occurred, actually. But that paid for my tuition at 14 different small universities in the state of Pennsylvania. So not large ones like Penn State, Temple, or Pitt, but kind of smaller regional universities. And I chose one of them, Bloomsburg University, and I met a really impactful professor there who saw promise in me that I hadn't necessarily seen myself, who had traversed that PhD pathway, right, herself. And she started grooming me for graduate school before I knew that it was a possibility. She started providing me opportunities to conduct research, asking questions, encouraging me to, explore research questions that I thought were important, providing funding for me to attend conferences. And I was all able to do that because the military paid for my tuition, right? And as a result of her seeing that in me and seeing pathways that I wasn't able to see, then I went on and, applied to graduate school. And I came to the University of Florida to earn my master's degree in sociology, was here for 3 years, then went to earn my PhD at Purdue University. But as a result of that personal experience, I kind of see it as my career goal to continue to find pathways or to see pathways that students sometimes don't see for themselves. So I sometimes think about it as being like a real dense fog, right? There's a world out there, but you can't see it. It's a real dense fog. But there are some people who kind of navigated that pathway and have cleared it and have kind of moved the fog away and have tried to move obstacles for you in order for you to achieve your goals. And that's kind of how I see my role, right, as a professor. That's like my career path. Those are my career goals, is to kind of clear out the dense fog that exists for some students, to clear out the obstacles that exist in their way, right, to usher them along so that they can accomplish their goals. That's what drives me day in and out as a professor. And I feel incredibly fortunate and lucky that, that I get to do that. That's my job. That's what I'm paid to do. So.
That's really cool. I really like that. My next question is, can you tell me a little bit more about your family? You kind of mentioned your mom and dad. Do you want to talk more about them? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, my father, my family's great. They're amazing. Love them. So I guess I don't know how much more to say other than they grew up in deep poverty. They were among the first in their families to graduate from high school, and they've always provided nothing but support to me and my younger brother, right? Even in contexts where they weren't quite sure of how to provide the support, right? They had been to college, they were still doing everything they could, right, to help. And they continue to do everything they can to help. They continue to call me all the time to ask, how are things going, right? How's work? They don't always understand all the dynamics of the work that I do or the research that I'm conducting, but that's not important to them, right? And they help to, I think, I don't know, they're the foundation for everything that for my life, really, right? They're the foundation for everything that I think that I want to accomplish and anything that I have accomplished thus far.
I feel that. I feel like a lot of people from minoritized communities have parents like that, and it's really great. Was there an expectation for you to go to college from your parents, even though they didn't go to college?
I mean, there was kind of an unsaid, unwritten, and unenforced expectation. I think there was just a belief that it would happen. Mm-hmm. Without it being you have to, right? Without it being some sort of strict kind of expectation in that way. I think it was just kind of they did everything that they could to provide that foundation so that, that I could go to college, or so that my brother could go to college. And they found out ways that I could join the military to get, to have my college paid for. So in that regard, yeah, I mean, there was an expectation, but it wasn't one that was, I guess, rigid or stressful. It was one that was supportive and loving and kind.
Can you tell me a little bit what higher education means to you, for you, for your family, for everyone around you?
That's a good question. I mean, higher education can mean upward socioeconomic mobility, right? One of the things that my family had struggled with for a long period of time was living in deep poverty, and really deep poverty. Stability is something that I think that like economic stability, not worrying about whether or not you can afford food, right? Not worrying about whether or not you can afford rent, not worrying about whether or not you can afford transportation. Those are things that I think my parents instilled at a young age too. Like that's something that you want, right? That's something that you need, and that's something that you should be striving for. And higher education is one avenue, right, by which that can occur. It doesn't always occur. But I also think that in terms of like what I study, right, like Latino studies, ethnic studies, studying, histories of marginalization and oppression and racism and systemic racism, then in that regard, higher education can also open people's minds to things that they've experienced, but perhaps didn't have the words to explain. And sometimes it can provide pathways for people to try to advocate against these juggernauts of inequality, of racialized oppression. And sometimes higher education can perpetuate, right, these same racial inequalities and systems of marginalization. So it is all of those things wrapped into one complex set of institutions.
Yeah, true. So you mentioned earlier you identified Latino, correct?
Yeah.
How did you start learning about Latino studies? Because, it's not readily available almost anywhere in the country,
It's a really great question. And I came to it late because when I went to my undergraduate school, it was, it's a small rural school. It was predominantly a white institution. There were not many Latinos there. There were not many students of color at all. There weren't many Black students there. I did not have a Latino professor. I don't think I had a Latino teacher until I came to graduate school at the University of Florida for the first time when I was taught by Hernan Vera. So there was definitely no Latino studies at Bloomsburg University as an undergraduate. When I was studying there, I was studying sociology more broadly, starting to think about questions of race and ethnicity, but Latino studies wasn't on my radar. When I came to the University of Florida, there was a Latino studies program, right? As a graduate student, like that didn't exist. There were maybe a couple of courses that existed related to Latinos, but still it wasn't a core component of my scholarly experience here at UF. When I went to Purdue University, I started to work on a dissertation related to racial identity contestation, thinking about how broadly other folks, like how people measure what race is in like social surveys, on the census when you fill it out, or anytime anybody fills out any document for a US institution. Usually there's a racial category that people have to check. Like when you're born, there's a category that's checked, right? When you die, there's a category that's checked. And sometimes the category that's checked when you're born doesn't match the category that's checked when you die. And that became of interest to me. Like, what are these categories? How do people self-identify racially in ways that are or are not shared by how you're perceived, right? What proportion of the population identifies with one group, but perhaps is perceived as members of another group? And I feel like Latinos face this struggle and challenge a lot, right? That's something that I had been facing, my whole life, thinking about like, where do Latinos fit into US society? Where do Latinos fit into that small rural community in Pennsylvania that I was living in, where we experienced some level of marginalization and not quite inclusion, right? So like, how does Latinidad play out, right, in this nation? Those were questions that I'd always been interested in, but never really had an opportunity to study. But my dissertation research on racial classification, I think, led me to start exploring much more deeply Latino studies as a discipline and questions about Latino racial classification, identity, inequality, and experiences of marginalization. And that existed at Purdue University without a Latino faculty member. Without Latino faculty members on my committee, without a Latino studies department. I think it was just me finally finding a data or a research project that I could engage that felt really meaningful and powerful to me.
So I kind of like, I feel like what you're saying right now, because I'm having trouble doing my research at some point, because like there's not a foundation here at University of Florida. Can you kind of elaborate how hard it is to like do that kind of studies when there's not something in place to help students to conduct that kind of research?
I mean, it becomes really hard because, I mean, it's hard for a lot of reasons. One way that it becomes hard is that like the ideas aren't even floating around in conversations or in the broader discourse so much that you can kind of think about them or reflect upon them that much in conversation with that of others, right? So we tend to think of like academic spaces as ones where people really do engage ideas and where you can hear different perspectives. You can kind of synthesize other people's arguments along with your own and really grow intellectually. Right. But if there aren't conversations being had about these topics, then how do you grow intellectually with regards to these topics? It becomes really challenging. So on one level, like it shapes what you think about, right? Like a lack of this presence shapes like literally the ideas that go on in your head on a day-to-day basis. And if you're not thinking about these ideas, then your ability to explore them and with research, or even your choice to explore them, right, is far less likely. Another way that it becomes challenging is that there are, right, where if higher ed is this space where we're having these conversations, there are people who are really smart, who've spent their entire lives thinking about particular topics that you can learn from, that can support you and mentor you and guide you, right, in areas of research. But for that student, for those students that without the social space supporting these ideas still come to reach them themselves and say, like, these are important ideas, Latino identity, Latinidad, right? The history of Latinos, these are important things that I want to engage without that support, which I think is already challenging, right? You have a student that can do that, that's fantastic. But then they don't have many places to go to receive the mentorship and guidance of like, okay, you need to read this, right? Have you thought about this? What have you thought about this idea? They don't have that like institutional support or the faculty support that can help usher them along in the process. Whereas it does exist, right, for lots of other topics and lots of other ideas.
True.
So I think those are maybe the two ways in which it's difficult. One is like, what do you think about? Two is after you've thought about it, what do you do, right? And like you ask, like, what do I do? And if there's nobody to answer that question, then you're really just kind of lost. So I think that those are the two ways in which that becomes really challenging.
Yeah, true. I get that. So my next question is like, do you see Latino studies spreading across the United States? Because like you talk about like, you know, Pennsylvania, you didn't have the opportunity, you didn't have that type of schooling, but even in Florida, like you are the first Latino professor, or Latino like curriculum-based professor here. Do you see it spreading, and do you see it spreading to Florida?
I hope so. I think so. That's the goal. That's a plan, right? Yeah, I hope so. I mean, since I've come here, there have been a number of other faculty who engage some topics related to Latinidad or that might be loosely tied or loosely attached to Latino studies. So they're here and they're doing Latino studies work, but they weren't hired necessarily to do that. And there were people who came before me that were also doing what would be referred to as Latino studies work, but they weren't hired specifically to do that work. Like Hernan Vera, right, was fantastic. And he did work that I think that would be, you know, squarely situated within Latino studies. Milagros Peña, did work right in Latino studies and related to Latino studies, but wasn't hired to do that work, right? Paul Ortiz, right? Fantastic work related to Latino studies, but wasn't I don't think was necessarily hired, right, to do that work. So there are people that do it, but as a result, what happens is because it hasn't been like a concerted effort to bring people in to do that work, people become loosely attached. They were hired to do different types of things. So there's this kind of nascent, like free floating, like sometimes people come together to do some work related to Latino studies, sometimes they don't, type approach that exists at UF. But the more people we have, I think the greater the possibilities are to have a more robust curriculum around these topics for sure. Jillian Hernandez was hired a few years ago, who does fantastic work related to Latino studies. Cici Suarez, right, also does fantastic work that's in part related to Latino studies. So like Elizabeth, I think it's Elizabeth Garcia, I think was here for a while and also doing work, right, related to Latino studies. So there are people who do the work. We just need to find some sort of space or time or resources to pull us together to make something more purposeful and more structural.
Do you think if there was a department solely focused on Latino studies that would help you like find faculty that just focus on it instead of being like associated with like the Center for Latin American Studies and then being tenured under like sociology in your case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yes, but only if it's like really supported, right? Like it would probably be worse to have like a Department of Latino Studies with 2 faculty, right? And then everybody else is like affiliated. It depends on how many faculty you have, how much institutional support exists, how much independence exists. As you know, right, African American Studies is becoming a department, like, you know, it's in the process right now after 50 years of struggle and essentially trying to like advocate for that. And I think that program is going to thrive, in part because there have been, you know, a decent number of resources allocated. There are a decent number of faculty lines that are going to be allocated to that. And I think they need to provide additional lines in the future as well. But it seems as though that's going to be a nice, it's going to represent important growth. And it's going to be a strong department as a result of maybe some of the institutional support that's been provided, and the people that they've hired. Latino studies, much like any other discipline, would need the same type of input, the same type of support, I think, to really thrive at the university.
So what do you think is the next step for Latino studies at the University of Florida?
The next step, I hope, is to, well, it depends. One of the challenges that I face right now is in thinking about Latino studies, especially at the undergraduate level. I think at the graduate level, we have a relatively decent, robust offering for master's level students who are in our Masters for Latin American Studies program. I think that is relatively well solidified. But it becomes more challenging at the undergraduate level because our faculty are all over the place. They are in the College of Education, they are in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, they are in the Center for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And as a result, sometimes they teach courses related to Latino studies and sometimes they don't, right? That's not the core focus of what their job is or what their job responsibilities are. And what that means as we're trying to like pull courses together is that we don't know when any course will be taught because it's kind of at the whims of other decision makers on campus. But that's something that I want to provide some increased attention and focus on in the upcoming years, especially probably the upcoming year. And it's, yeah, so I'm going to take a much closer look at that, but that's one of the very real challenges that we face right now. If things change, if let's say the Center for Latin American Studies were to hire more folks or to provide more lines in Latino studies, then that might provide additional courses that will be taught every semester or every other semester, that we could really have something like a minor or a very clear kind of certificate that I think we could draw from. And that would help solidify things a little more. That's one of my hopes, but who knows? So I'm not sure if that's going to be possible or not.
Can you like elaborate on like a plan you might have, like potentially? Like I know it's a lot of work and I know it's like a big question, but do you think you can elaborate?
There's some things that are potentially in the works that I'm unclear on right now, to be honest. Like I don't know. There's some proposals that I've made about my own role and responsibilities on campus in the Center for Latin American Studies and in sociology, whether or not I might be able to allocate more of my time to Latino studies than what I had previously. And if I'm able to do that, then I think that there are certainly opportunities maybe to grow a minor and to make, to increase enrollments for the Introduction to Latino Studies course that I teach and to add other courses to the curriculum in a way that I think would really help. But I don't know whether or not, like those decisions, the people who make those decisions are not me. So I'm waiting to hear back on what's to come.
How long do you think we'd be like potentially away from having a minor, having maybe even an undergraduate major or even a PhD program? Like how far do you think UF is from?
A minor we could probably do, if we have the support, I think a minor we could probably have within 2 years.
Okay.
Right, 2 years. A major would take, I think you can't have a major unless you have a department. And a department is a much longer, right, process. But a minor or certificate, I think we could have in a year and a half or 2 years. That's my first goal. Like that's what's on my agenda, is like goal number one for continuing to grow Latino studies on campus.
Do you, is this like work falling onto like professors like you, who, even though you are so like you do have like tenure in sociology, you have to put in the work to make sure students are able to have like minor stuff? Is that the work? Are you okay with having that work? And then is it a lot of work to have?
Well, I mean, of course I'm okay with it. Like, like that's the work that I love to do because I think that it's impactful. I won't say that it's not overwhelming at times. I won't say that it would be nice to have additional faculty that maybe, it'd be nice to have additional lines of faculty who would be allocated to doing similar types of work or to support growth of Latino studies. But yes, I'm okay with it. But at the same time, it can be challenging at times. It's a lot of labor, and it's a lot to take on for a small number of individuals. Sure.
Also, can you elaborate a little bit more about like the resources that need to be made to make a minor and potentially a major? Like you talk about faculty, money, but like can you like elaborate more on that?
What does that look like? Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's just giving time, right? Allocating time, giving people time to make a plan for what that will look like, getting people in the same room to talk together about what a curriculum would look like. And I think we can do that. I don't think that becomes really challenging, but it would be, it may come to fruition. I'm hoping that it does. I'm hoping that by fall of this upcoming semester, that there's going to be an increased allocation of time for people to dedicate to these causes, for me especially, to be able to be dedicated to this cause, that I think will just help facilitate it. Joint appointments can be challenging. So I'm 50% in one department and 50% in the Center for Latin American Studies. So essentially half of me is allocated to teaching, right, Latino studies. Half of me is allocated to doing like some sort of research. Half of me is allocated to supporting master's students in the Latin American Studies program, to doing service in the Center for Latin American Studies. And the other half of me is supporting PhD students in sociology, teaching courses in sociology, doing sociological work, attending faculty meetings, doing service within the institution and outside the institution. I think that can work. I think joint appointments can work quite well. I think they become challenging when you're in charge of like, when you envision or when you want to plan the growth of a program, right? That there are high expectations placed upon you in many different ways. And this ends up being only a small segment of the responsibilities that are placed upon you. And it's sometimes not the one that others are most concerned about, right?
Sure. What do you think a Latino studies like minor major can do for students? And then what can they use that like minor major for? Because I feel like a lot of ethnic studies don't get enough attention because people don't think you can use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that the minor will do something for you. I think in some ways there are already like these courses that are being offered so that if you were able to take them, right, then you can continue to grow and learn and think about important topics, hopefully give back to communities, think about a career path that might be supportive of, one's community, or make changes in whatever field of specialization you take on in your career path, thinking with ideas of colonialism, racial marginalization in mind, right? I think that a lot of that can happen now. It'd just be much easier for students to be able to know where to go to collect a minor, to know which courses to take, and for it to just be an easy path. The responsibility shouldn't be on students to search everywhere across the university to look for these courses, right? There should be some sort of, easy path for students to engage. So I think, I guess I think that's what a minor would do, is it would make it easier for students to be able to find the resources on campus that already exist. And it would hopefully also solidify in all of these loosely tied faculty across the university. Like they might be able to bring that to their superiors and say, look, no, there's this real established minor that exists that I want to help support, right? In that sense, like it becomes official rather than kind of loose, and maybe there'd be more support for it in those contexts as well.
Okay. So my next question was like, I think I was trying to say, how meaningful would it be for Latino students to come in and see there's like a Latino minor, here? Like how meaningful would that be maybe for you if you would have came into your school and saw that?
That's a good question. I mean, I never had that experience, but I would imagine that it would be quite nice. That you have, you have support, you have faculty who may look like you, who may have similar types of experiences to you, who may just have some sort of solid understanding of maybe some of the challenges and experiences that you faced as a student just getting to a university like the University of Florida. And when we see ourselves represented in the curriculum, we come to recognize our own identities, not as detriments to education, but as, as providers of education, as integral to education. When we see ourselves represented in the curriculum of a university, we come to recognize ourselves not as visitors at this university, but as people who belong, right, at this university, and people who contribute meaningfully, right, very meaningfully to the university. So, yeah, I think it would be impactful in that way for sure.
Sure. Thank you for that answer. So my next question would be, what do you think the University of Florida needs to do? Like, what do you think the University of Florida needs, like a push for Latino studies, or you think they're like ready to take that on with the right like structure that someone creates?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. That's the question that I want to learn more about. I don't know. I don't know where the university is right now in terms of supporting fully like a Latino studies department. My sense is it's probably not on the radar. My plan of thought is probably to build minor. If the minor is like successful, you have a lot of students enrolled in the minor and it continues to grow, then you can advocate for maybe some sort of more structural transformation thereafter. But first stage, I think, is getting the minor and getting large enrollments in a minor. I think that has to precede probably any additional transformations, because you have to convince administrators that students really want these courses. And to be honest, when I first got here, that was some of the challenges that I was facing with even just offering Intro to Latino Studies. I think students sometimes had difficulty finding the course, and enrollments were relatively low at first. They're starting to go up. They're starting to increase, which is good. But that's one challenge, and I think that's the first hurdle that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so I have two questions now. A couple more questions actually. When did you start offering Intro to Latino Studies?
2015.
Really?
Yes.
I've only heard about it. I've been here since 2017. I've only heard about it last year. I wonder, like, why do you think that is?
That's a good, I don't know. That's a good I had spoken, I'd spoken to folks at MCDA about it. We've publicized it. I think at some point in time, like there weren't other faculty doing anything related to Latino studies here yet. Like Jillian Hernandez wasn't here yet. Cici Suarez wasn't here yet. Elizabeth Garcia wasn't here. Chris Busey wasn't here. A lot of other folks weren't here. I was I was one of the only more recently hired faculty members doing teaching courses like this. Efrain Baradas is amazing, and he had been here for a very long time teaching some courses related to Latino studies. Lillian Guerra and history and others were teaching courses and often teach courses related to like particular like national origin groups, sometimes maybe Puerto Ricans or Cuban Americans. That's like kind of loosely tied to Latino studies. But when I first arrived, I think that there wasn't community around these ideas or topics. So maybe since it may have been like the only course, it may have been less well known, whereas now there's a more robust offering all across the campus, and then there's increased enrollments in that way. I'm not sure. It's a really great question that I was concerned about and curious about when I arrived, to be quite honest.
Yeah, honestly, I never even knew there was a Latin American Studies minor until I got to my junior year. And at that point, it was basically like, I'm going to graduate in a year. There's not really a point I can take it. So now I'm kind of curious like why there hasn't been much like publicity, I guess I could say.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, as you had mentioned previously, when like advisors or parents or others are encouraging their students to go to college, they're often, encouraging them to think about particular majors or career paths. When I went to college, I was a first generation college student. I thought you'd be like a teacher, a lawyer, a nurse, right? You had like 5 jobs that existed in the world with a college degree. That's what my naive mind kind of thought that. And then you go into one of those areas without recognizing that there's so many more course offerings that exist on college campuses, and that the vast majority of people, right, earn a degree in a field, ended up making transitions in their career thereafter that may or may not always align with the exact right things that they learned in their coursework, right? It may go on to shape their lives in important ways. The way of thinking, the way that they bring themselves to this new job, I think, can really be beneficial. But a lot of times when people think about college, they think about it as training for a job. And the question is like, okay, so, what's the job that comes after? And that can be a challenge that exists for, all of the humanities, many of the social sciences, so on and so forth.
That's true. I know a lot of, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, you go. Do your interview.
Okay. So with that said, then even when talking with like academic advisors, if this is the first time an introduction to Latinx studies course is being offered in 2015, the academic advisors are frequently unaware of it. When freshmen are coming in during preview, they're not necessarily thinking about Latino studies. In that sense, because I think it was new, there just wasn't a whole lot of discussion around it as being a core offering.
So my next question would be like, what could students do to support like the work that you're doing? Would it just be taking the courses that you offer in Latino studies, or is there more that they can do?
Yeah, no, I think certainly course enrollments matter and they help. And even like coming together and thinking about like what types of courses might they like to see, what types of offerings would be helpful, I think would be a nice step as well. That's asking students to do things that's not students' responsibility, right? It shouldn't be your responsibility to do those types of things. But if students were to do that, then that could potentially be helpful as well, for sure.
How would they be able to do that? Like, who would they have to go to talk about
themselves? Themselves and me, but themselves first. Students have power. Students sometimes have significantly more power than faculty can have. That seems strange to many students, but that's the reality.
That's true. Like African American Studies program that wasn't created until students protested. So
that's right.
So I guess my next
Latino studies as a discipline didn't exist until students protested.
Sure.
Chicano studies didn't exist until students protested. The growth, like my job wouldn't exist without student protests, without students saying that we're not reflected in the curriculum and we need people to be representing us because we are foundation of this nation, right? And why are our stories not being told? Why are we learning only about other people and other people's contributions to society and not our own? What happens, right, when these are the lessons that are taught? And what message are you sending when that is what the curriculum is, right? Like those are the questions that early students were asking, and those are the eventually the demands that early students had, is that we need to address these things. Yeah, students have power.
True. So throughout my research, I've realized building a program, building a minor, building a department isn't like quick, and I feel like that was something naive of me to think when I started my research. I do realize it's a slow burn, but like, when is it too long of a burn? Because like you said, African American Studies been a program for 50 years, but I've like seen interviews where people are demanding it in like 2011, 2005. So like, when is too long?
Yesterday.
Yesterday.
The day before. Like if it's today, it was too long yesterday, right? Like when is it too long? It's already too long. It's already too long.
Yeah. But the work still needs to be done now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, it's already too long. James Baldwin has like a really great quote when, like, in an interview that he was conducting about progress taking time, right? I mean, he talks about like, yeah, it does take time. It takes, it's like, you know, it takes my aunt's time, it takes my uncle's time, it takes my cousin's time, it takes my time. How much time do you need for your progress? Is what he asks. Yeah. And what happens, like, what in that time, right?
True. So I have a couple more questions because I don't want to take up. We only said an hour. So, my next question would be, what do you see that there's like there's certain areas in the United States, like the South and like Florida, that do lack these ethnic studies? Like, is that is that a problem, or is it just everywhere and we need to start like just working on it here and like spreading it?
Latino studies, ethnic studies, Black studies, the patterns can be a little bit different across different spaces. Like, we might not expect a robust Latino studies program in Montana.
True.
Expect it, right? Like, the likelihood that it'll exist, probably not very high. The likelihood that people, if an institution poured resources to it, that it would become strong and robust, probably not incredibly high, right? I'm not sure that it would be really successful in a space like that. Florida's a space where Latino studies can grow, right? Has the potential to grow quite rapidly. It's like low-hanging fruit because it should have existed yesterday. And by yesterday, I mean 10 years ago. And by 10 years ago, I mean 10 years ago, right? So it should have existed yesterday. I don't know. I mean, sure, I would advocate for Latino studies in Alabama. I would advocate for it in North Carolina and South Carolina and Mississippi, across the South, as you were mentioning. But Florida specifically, like Florida especially, like a different, you know, in terms of like Latin American influence, in terms of the share of the population, the share of the Latino population that lives in Florida, in terms of like the increasing population of Latinos across the state of Florida. Yeah, I mean, Florida's low-hanging fruit. Florida should definitely be emphasizing Latino studies.
True. Why do you think it hasn't emphasized it yet?
It's a good question. I think it's a dynamic and a little bit of a complex answer when we think about the different kind of ethno-racial groups that have come to live within different regions of the United States and who went to advocate, who protested, who walked out of their high schools and said that like our lives are not reflected in these curriculums, kind of came to experience, I think, US racialization or ethno-racialization, perhaps a little bit differently than the dominant Latino groups who came to inhabit much of Florida. And they started to think about themselves and their relationships to the United States perhaps a little bit differently. I think Cuban Americans have had a different racialized experience and a different experience of US integration throughout many of the different immigration waves, not all of them, in comparison to, let's say, Mexican Americans in the southwestern portion of the United States when they were advocating for Chicano studies. And in comparison to, let's say, Puerto Ricans who are living in the northeastern portion of the United States when they were advocating for Puerto Rican studies. There just wasn't that same push, right, for that type of like Latino studies or Cuban American studies. There was a push for like Cuban studies, but not necessarily Cuban American studies in the same capacity. So I think some of it is related to like the socio-political, economic, and racial context within which the groups that like live in these regions came to understand themselves and the broader U.S. society and the relationship with the broader U.S. society. But I don't think that explanation holds anymore. I mean, I don't think that I think that Florida as a state, I wholly believe that Latino studies could grow dramatically and has the potential to grow dramatically across many institutions in Florida today.
Thank you for that. I only have two more questions because I know we're crunched. If you give a message to future generations of minoritized students coming to UF, what would you say to them?
It's a tough question. I mean, you're here for a reason. You can thrive here. You may face challenges. You are strong. You are smart. And you can extract resources. There are ways in which your experience here can be one that you can take from the institution what you need, even if the institution wasn't necessarily created to give it to you in that way. Right. And I encourage you to try to do that. I also would encourage you to push so that that won't be necessary. That you won't have to feel like you're stealing from an institution, but rather like you are the institution.
So this is my last question. Do you have anything you want to say before we finish? Like any last thoughts I didn't cover?
No, just you asked some really great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing it. If I can be of any support, please don't hesitate.
Well, thank you for this interview. Like, I really appreciate it. I think I learned a lot about potential of Latino studies here at UF. So I'm just going to end the recording. I'm going to ask you a couple questions after,
Sure.
but end the recording now.